Midvale, Bianca Tomasini, Ben Kempinen, um, Pastors Katie and Blake. Who am I missing? Danielle Lawson and Ruth Manning are also part of the group, but we're not able to be here today. Did I get everybody? Who did I miss? Maybe that's everybody. But I'll just say real quick, this is part of our ongoing attempt to educate, to offer resources, as we're all, I think, can agree that everybody is asking a lot more hard questions of ourselves and our culture and communities at large. And so one of the things we've talked about is offering educational opportunities and then definitely giving a chance for us to come together and discuss. So today is going to be largely just that opportunity to discuss. I have some questions that I can guide us through. But if you have other comments, things, please feel free to speak or put them in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on that as well. But before we get any further, I'm going to turn it over to Jen so she can open us with prayer.
And I just want to make sure everybody can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, then let us start in prayer. Holy One, in your image, you have created humankind in great diversity. We give thanks for the differences. Holy One, in your image, you have created humankind in great diversity. We give thanks for the differences of cultures and ethnicities, of histories and life stories, of skin color and language and hearts that love the world. We watch in horror as power desecrates Black and brown bodies, walks on their sacredness, kills and subjugates in thousands of ways, hidden and overt. We must not stop at watching, held back from right action by our horror or seeming powerlessness. Grant us hearts that listen and learn, egos that are willing to accept when our own racism is called out. Grant us courage to disassemble the systems, the stories, the mythos that privilege whiteness over all others. Give us your Holy Spirit's wind to call out racism in all its forms, inside our hearts, inside the church, and in your world. Give us the strength, the wisdom, and the will to root out white fragility and white supremacy so that they would never again do harm, never again take away, never again kill. Help us to be anti-racist in all that we say and all that we do and all that we are. It is time. It is well past time. God of all creation, bless us all with what we need to march on, to live this work of anti-racism today, every day, always. In Jesus' name, may it be. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Jen. So as we all know, this is the 13th is a pretty heavy documentary, I think, to say the least. And this can be a challenging thing to talk about. Race in general in this country can be hard to talk about. So we're all learning. We're all in different points. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Tony. Some of you may have heard these before when we had another adult forum, but we came across something called the rules that I would like to have us all keep in mind for this discussion. So Tony, you want to share?
Well, I forgot that I was doing this. Does anyone have the rules? We've done these rules so many times.
You know what? I don't, well, does anybody have them? Because I don't have them right in front of me, but we can paraphrase. The gist is no judgments, please. And I'm really not very concerned with this group, but I do remember there was one something about like no upstaging anybody with your wokeness. That one always kind of makes me chuckle. But yeah, just be kind, be compassionate. We're all learning. Just offer ourselves and each other lots of grace and keep our hearts and our minds open. The idea is that hopefully we're all learning something. We're all gaining broader perspective. So, and even though I did agree to moderate, I want to say that my companions on the racial justice group, please feel free to jump in at any point and yeah, and help me in this. And I also want to acknowledge and thank Ben Kempinen. Hopefully you all received the fact sheet that Ben put together for us, which took a lot of the shocking, frankly, statistics and data that we learned in 13th, and then he distilled that for Wisconsin so we can see what's happening here. And so I know Ben is willing to focus our lens on Wisconsin at some point in this conversation as well. But I'm just going to jump right in. So I'm just curious, how many of you had actually seen 13th, or how many of you had seen it before and have had a chance to watch it before this conversation? Looks like almost all of us. I saw it when it first came out, and then I rewatched it recently. Wow, it hits even harder now. I think everything feels so much more real, especially, you know, in the week, last week and this week coming ahead. It as our capital is boarded up, I mean, it feels very, very just important, I think, that we look at this and we talk about this as a group and as a congregation and people of faith. I also want to say, you know, and this will be a surprise to absolutely no one, but we are not subject matter experts, and we're not claiming to be. We're just learning together because, of course, when you know better, you do better. So I invite everyone to share your comments, ask your questions as we have this respectful dialogue. And I want to thank everybody for being here, because again, it's kind of tough to have these conversations, so we really appreciate it. I'm just going to jump right into a question. And again, everyone, feel free. We want to hear from everybody. But how did you feel after viewing 13th? Did you feel helpless, inspired, stirred to action? A combination of all three. Do you think the film was ultimately hopeful? Why or why not? Anyone?
Lori, don't forget to look at the chats as well. There's an interesting comment from Mika. I think that's...
Yes. Vika said, I had to take a break from it though. Yes. Yes, I hear that. You want to say some more?
So first of all, I wanted to, since I'm new to the group, I'm Vika Steele, for those of you who weren't here when I introduced myself. I came out 2 years ago, transgender woman. I guess I'm going to segue here for a second, because I'm so in love with the way church has changed since when I was a child. I'm looking at all these faces of people who are taking time out of their lives to sit here and talk about anti-racism and to talk about how race is such a big factor. And it doesn't impact us, you know, not directly, not like it does Black folks, but we're still here. You're still here. And it's moving. I started sitting in on Midvale sermons because of that welcoming, that open welcoming for queer folks. And I like to, I don't know, I'm rambling now, so I'm sorry. But back to what we were talking about was just that sense of, I've been looking at anti-racism and stuff like that for 3 years. I'm a school teacher. And so I felt like walking in, oh, I know all of this stuff. I'm ready to take it all. It's hard to see. It's one thing to read it. It's one thing to know it's out there, but to watch everything that's happening and to connect all those dots. Like I said, I had to take a break from it, and then hopefully I'll come back and be able to finish it later.
I would just like to disagree a little bit with what you said, Vika. I've read quite a bit in the 19th century, and the anti-slavery people frequently made the, particularly the ones who lived in the South and really had firsthand experience with slavery, they often made the point that the people who were the owners, quote unquote, of the slaves were just as corrupted by the system as the slaves themselves, that it was very detrimental to everyone in the system, whether they were an oppressor or oppressed. And I think that's true. I think we have this
I don't disagree with
festering,
that.
yeah,
No.
I think we have this festering sewer that underlies our society that we have to address.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. The way I said it wasn't really correct there, but you're absolutely right. It does affect us all. It just doesn't affect us as immediately in some ways as it does Black and brown folks. And we can ignore it, but yes, it definitely eats away. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Vika, and welcome.
Well, I'll just say one quick comment. As I mentioned, I watched it when it first came out, and I was horrified, shocked, amazed, all of the above. And yet I couldn't help but, kind of wonder, like, and I think it was in 2016 or maybe 2017, like, is there any bias here? I always try to watch things with a critical eye. And then watching it again, it hits differently. I think for many of us, our eyes have been opened. Like I no longer question, is that a fair assessment of police brutality, for instance? Because now there's no question that goes on, and I'm not condemning all police, but whereas I think the first time I saw it, I wasn't quite so sure how I felt. So I guess my point in all that is that, yes, this has been going on for centuries. And as the film says, these systems of oppression and power, they just keep shifting and morphing from one thing to the other, from slavery to Jim Crow. And I know I'm grossly overgeneralizing, but then to segregation and then mass incarceration. And I thought that was just a really interesting concept. And there's so many facts and data to prove that out. Anyone else have any comments about how the film made you feel, or any reaction, just general reactions to it?
I think for me, it made me feel a little hopeful and a little not hopeful because of the massive legislative effort that's structurally been created over so many presidencies, it's like there's this constant one-upsmanship that has been happening that's led to the whole incarceration thing. And I think for me, it has made me, my action piece needs to be in working in any little way I can to dismantle those structures that are so ingrained these days.
Yeah, Tony, I have to agree with you. One of the things the film did for me, two things. One is it brought home how inadequate my African American Studies minor in my PhD program was, because we didn't talk about the 13th Amendment. The other is how systemic racism got ingrained from the very beginning in our culture. And as Tony said, what's hopeful is that our legislation has slowly eroded some of that, but yet it's still endemic to our culture. That made me feel both helpless and hopeful, to be honest. But I thought the film did an excellent job of really documenting how racism gets systematized and accepted through law and politics and legislation, and how it can be then undone. But that's a really slow process. So that's my comment. Thanks.
Well, this is Nancy. I of course did not see the film, but what we see going on with elections and with making it more difficult for people to vote and for taking away more rights, whether it's where people vote or how many places there are to vote. I mean, there is a constant, and has been throughout our history, an erosion of making it possible for there to be, quote unquote, a more perfect union and more equity. And so we're definitely at a point where hopefully more people understand all the pieces that are part of making life more difficult for particularly individuals of color, but also many other marginalized populations as well. So I think we're at a point where hopefully more and more people, particularly who are white, begin to get a better understanding of the extent to which there are more than just threads. The fabric is woven by many of these negatives for a certain percentage of the population to maintain a very superior position. Thank you.
Nancy, just to give you a quick synopsis of the point of the film, 13th refers to the 13th Amendment.
Right, I have it right in
specifically-
front of me. I have that right in front of me, the 13th
Right.
Amendment.
Which specifically says that no one can be enslaved in the United States unless they've been duly convicted of a crime.
Right, right.
And it's that corruption that's really at the heart of this terrible
Right.
situation.
But there are so many pieces related to it. No, I've got the Constitution right in front of me. So, and I just reread that article. Thank you. Thank you, Jocelyn.
Sure, it's sort of shocking, you know, it's in the Constitution. I never had really heard that before.
Thank
I
you,
wanted
Nancy
to
and
follow
Jocelyn.
up on Tony and Greg. I think the thing that I caught the most was how ignorant I am. And I have paid attention to this. I mean, we had Midvale involved in civil rights stuff back in '68. But how many, I was especially intrigued with how naive I was on the dog whistles. How many of the programs were put through as something totally different than the racism that they were. So I was amazed at my ignorance.
Thanks, Rhoda, and thank you, Nancy and Jocelyn too. But I think that's a really good point, Rhoda, that I mean, I think, again, we can all offer ourselves a little bit of grace because it's so hard to know. Those dog whistles are so deep, they're so pervasive. I mean, I felt the exact same way. I thought I've been paying attention, and the more, I mean, you learn, and it's just shocking. And I thought a lot about, you know, even the use of the word criminals. I mean, in some ways, I was thinking about that. That's in some ways almost a dog whistle in this context. I mean, because we have our definition of what a criminal is, that somebody who's done wrong and is serving their time. But in so often, I think, as we saw, that was a dog whistle. And I mean, and even the way that I wrote down some notes, you know, the Black Panthers were labeled as criminals, particularly by the Nixon administration. And then I thought, well, that's just continuing, because that's what so many people say about the Black Lives Matter movement too. They're trying to be painted as criminals. And then you see the power of criminalizing Black people. It makes it so easy to ignore their humanity, and also to somehow separate ourselves from that. We're not dangerous criminals, right? And we're never thinking to ourselves, oh, I'm better than a Black person. But when you label people, whole groups of people, Black men in particular, as criminals, it's easy to separate ourselves from that. And I think that's, you know, really dangerous. And I couldn't help but think about, you know, how that's used to justify violence. And then that made me think, what did Jesus teach us about the other? You know, what did Jesus teach us about humanizing all, not separating, not enforcing class systems? So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
Well, I can give you kind of a funny anecdote, or a story, if you like. When I was a teenager, some friends of mine and I went joyriding, and the police officer pulled over my friend who was driving, and my friend smarted off and said, well, why aren't you arresting people who are breaking the law? And the man looked at him and he goes, I haven't arrested you yet, but you are. And it was one of those points where, you know, it just kind of hit you that if you violate the laws, then you are in fact engaged in criminal behavior of sorts. I'm not an attorney, so I can't make the distinctions of levels of crime and those kinds of things. But it's amazing to me how we use those labels to categorize and dismiss entire entities and or people and thoughts and processes. And, you know, like I said, when I was, and my friend just kind of went, oh, and his entire behavior at that point was modified, and he was a very different person after that for a while. Not going to say it was life changing, but it definitely made an impact on all of us that were in the car.
I'm reminded of raising children. Children do things that aren't right, and we try to correct that behavior. We don't label them as criminals because they did something, you know, hit their brother or sister. We love them, and we say, well, that was a bad act. Let's not do that act anymore. And that's not what society does in so many cases, because you become defined by one action or, you know, series of actions. And that's just not right.
You know,
I
this is
think one
Ben
of the
Kempton.
most,
I was going to just make a couple of comments, and you know, one reaction, and it'd be interesting to see what others think. And again, I have either the burden or benefit of having worked in this area for 40 years. I would suggest, I think the title of the movie is somewhat misleading, because the 13th Amendment really, in my experience, has had very little to do with criminal justice policies and the disparities we have. There's a number of other reasons that I think that are primarily dealing with income inequality and the lack of other opportunities and whatnot. And a couple of things I might just throw out is one, one thing that distinguishes the 13th Amendment from Jim Crow laws and other things is the precondition to be classified under that is not based on race, skin color, ethnicity. It's based on being convicted of a crime. And that is really a matter of states. And
Go listen to this.
There's a bit of overselling the notion that this is some sort of a national consistent movement, because every state has their own approach to criminal justice. There's certainly a lot of similarities and whatnot. And I think as some of the facts I've shared, we've in some respects have done a fairly abysmal job in Wisconsin. But you know, one thing I might just share, which I was astounded my students, I looked at our criminal statutes in the 1970s when I was in law school, and I looked at them a few years ago before I retired. And when you look at crimes against persons, crimes against property, crimes against government and whatnot, we have twice as many crimes in the statutes now as we did before. And what that means is that behaviors that had been historically not viewed as criminal are now. Why do we do that? Well, politically, a very quick fix when there is something that's annoying or comes to the attention of the public, rather than look at root causes or develop treatment or other alternatives, it's like, let's basically create a new crime. And if we looked at this sort of like a Venn diagram and sort of looked at all the behaviors that people can engage in, little by little more of them are subject to the criminal law. Now, where a lot of things come in is sort of discretion. If the police would have just let Nels and his friend go by, then there's no problem. If the police didn't like the way he looked at him and wanted to arrest him and referred it to the district attorney, then it would be subject to a criminal charge. If you referred it to the city attorney, it would be just an ordinance, which is like a ticket. And so in any event, you know, the notion that the 13th Amendment is somehow enabled, you know, criminal justice to sort of like sweep more broadly isn't necessarily true. And in all systems, you know, from the beginning of mankind, if you're convicted of a crime, there's a loss of freedom and whatnot. And if one looks at the definition of slavery, it's generally a loss of freedom and involuntary labor. The 13th Amendment does allow us to make people, you know, work when they don't want to. But I guess that one thing I would say to you, at least in the Wisconsin prison system, they don't rely on that. Jails in some counties do. They make people clean the bathrooms and stuff when they don't want to. But in the prison system in Wisconsin, having a job is very desirable by a lot of the inmates, partly to alleviate boredom and partly to develop some skills and to make a few dollars. Now, the wages in the prison system run from 20 cents an hour to $2 an hour and whatnot. So Wisconsin, you know, as in part of the Northwest Territory, to go back, we were designated a free territory. So slavery really never was a role or took hold in Wisconsin. And our prison system has never taken advantage of the 13th Amendment and saying, we're going to put you out on a chain gang or things of that nature. Now, clearly that's been different in many other states, but again, our experience has been somewhat different. And I think one of the reasons for so many people in prison, people of color and other poor people not of color, is that we've sort of, in my view, over criminalized. We keep passing new laws and whatnot, and think of the least creative way of dealing with behaviors that we see as undesirable. But enough said for just throw out a few ideas.
Hi, I just wanted to comment on what Lori, I'll start out with that. What Lori said, asked basically is, what would Jesus say about this? And immediately I just think of love your neighbor as yourself. That kind of puts it all in a nutshell. I have to admit that I've evolved amazingly in the last 20 years. I never ever thought I was racist, but I've been doing some reading and watching some movies, and I've really woken up. I mean, I think the first thing that really woke me up was the discrepancy in white versus Black incarceration. I mean, I read Byron Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, and also saw the movie. I would recommend that because I remember when my kids were little, they used to make comments about, why are there so many Blacks in prison, and or people of color. And I said, well, it's because they're committing more crimes. I mean, that's what I thought then. But like I said, my eyes have been opened. I'm learning a lot. One more comment is, I saw a little bit of Face the Nation this morning on CBS, and I was interested because I used to live in St. Paul, and they had the mayor currently of St. Paul featured because Minnesota, along with Wisconsin, Michigan, anyway, there are some 4 states in particular are prime targets, like starting today through the inauguration. So extra security is needed. And the mayor of St. Paul happens to be Black. And he commented that during the attack on the Capitol, the mob was heard saying things like, we're going to take back our country. Our country. This is a group of incited white supremacists. So how does that make anybody of color feel when they're saying our country? That obviously they're white supremacists, and they think this is their country. It's really amazing in this day and age, in 1920 or 2021, that this is still being thought of. And as far as the 13th, I had not seen it before. And I remembered yesterday, oh, I got to watch that. And I was at times I thought, oh, this is too much, but I didn't take a break. I felt compelled to keep watching. And I thought it was very interesting to begin with slavery. And really, it's just named different things throughout different decades, civil rights, and it just goes through different quote unquote names, but it's basically slavery. It hasn't really changed because of discrimination. And now I do believe there is such a thing as systemic racism. And thank you all for coming to this. I just find it really, really, really interesting and really important for us to talk about. So I'll let somebody else talk.
Thank you, Joanne. Does anybody else have a comment or question before I move on to anything else?
So for me, I'm a repeat watcher as well. I guess there were 2 takeaways that I took from it. One was the thread of the political use of our fear, societal fear, to build this system. It gives me a new light to see Trump in, not that it's a favorable one, but it's just like, if you put the dots together, he's kind of like the logical extension of everything that came before us, of playing to our fears as a society. And wow, that is something I think we as individuals, we need to kind of to wrestle with, and what part do we own in that? And allowing that kind of system to exist and continue. Sorry, I don't know what more I can say, and it's hard for me on that one. But I really like the way the movie ended. And I saw it the first time, but it really, really stuck with me the second time. The last thing is, one of the speakers, and I don't remember his name, I'm sorry, basically looking at the camera, having a conversation with the audience like they did a lot of times through the movie. And his point was, it's easy for us to sit here and say that, oh, if I was back there, I would have stopped that. I would not have allowed that. But it's still going on today, and you're allowing it. I mean, convicts me so, I mean, it's like a dagger through my heart. I just, I'm upset that I'm part of the system that allows this. So that's it. That was my points.
Thanks, Mark. I think a lot of us can relate to that very, very well.
I just wanted to mention something that I think, as far as opening up your eyes to the system, to me that has been really incredible watching that movie, because the system discriminates against people so much. And I think the 13th Amendment was really an interesting film, because it opened up my eyes to the way it morphs, the discrimination morphs. I finished reading the book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, and it's to do about the people migrating from the South up into the North, and how the system discriminates against Blacks, and how they made less money for the same job in New York and Pennsylvania and Detroit, and how the people migrated to have a better life. And that's what everybody wants. We're all migrants, and we're all migrating to get a better life. But it really opened up my eyes to the way that just because you have a different color skin, you can tell right away that you're different than a migrant from Ireland or England. Or so when you have a different colored skin, there's always morphing ways of people trying to discriminate against a person that has a different colored skin. So with that, I really thought the movie was very powerful.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, and one thing that stood out to me, I think it was Brian Stevenson, one of the featured speakers, made that comment of, don't forget when there was that massive migration of Black folks from the South going to the West Coast, Chicago, Detroit, they were refugees of extreme violence. And I think that was something I hadn't really thought of either. I just thought, seeking out better opportunities, but no, it was full on. I mean, it was that, but as well as fleeing horrific violence. Well, I'll just make another comment. So as the second time I watched this didn't have the same reaction the first time, but the second time, I think another theme that goes through all this, and several of the comments that many of you have made me think about this. I'm trying to make it all coalesce here. But we know there's systemic white supremacy. It's everywhere, but I kept thinking why? And one of the, common threads throughout this whole documentary, it's economics, right? It's money. People are making money off of discrimination of others, whether it's prison labor or, I mean, there's example after example. And I noted that often, they talked about the Reagan era, the war on drugs, and I'm probably not smart enough to make a really clear line here, but there was always the cry of the economy is tanking, we're in a rough time. And then all of a sudden there's a renewed effort, war on drugs, greater criminalization. You know, it's like you can start to see how we all are a part of this because of our capitalist system. And I'm not necessarily denouncing capitalism, but you know, who wants to go in and say, well, people are making money here, let's stop that. You know, we never want to stop our economy. So you can just see how it's just it's insidious and how it's so hard to stop, especially on, I'm thinking of it as an individual level. So I think it's even deeper than just hatred of Black people. Do you know what I mean? It's obviously that's evil, needs to be called out. But I think I'm often thinking, well, are we really just that evil? It's hard to believe that. And I think there is that. I want to be clear, but it's also our economic systems that keep enabling this. But that's just my opinion. Anybody have a
Lori, I was
comment or disagreement?
I was going to say
Please.
something about that is that the other thing that I don't think that we think about too often is that crime comes from poverty. And so if you don't have enough money to eat, to get a pair of shoes, whatever, I mean, there is a direct link to that. And so we can't kind of say, oh, well, you know, somebody had mentioned, not truthfully, but, you know, there's more Black people in prison because they commit more crimes. Well, it's because our white supremacist environment, our society has pushed them down. We pay them less. We keep them, we don't hire them for jobs. We didn't let the vets coming back take advantage of the offerings that other vets, white vets, had coming back from war. So, I mean, there's so many things. So I think that's my frustration with this, is that it's not just well, we just need to look at this. And then, I mean, it goes back so far, and it's, to me, watching the 13th Amendment, I just get so frustrated, and and I feel helpless. I really do. That's just my thing. I feel helpless. I think the other thing that I get sad about, I have two teenagers, both in high school. One's driving now. And when I read the book, The Hate You Give, which is a very good book, I would recommend that. It was a high school girl, and she was going out for a ride with a friend. And because of the color of their skin, when they got pulled over by a police officer, they had all these rules. You know, you put your hands up on the dashboard and you can't make sudden movements. And they had all of the stuff. And his dad taught him, and that this is what you have to do if a police officer pulls you over. And I was I had no idea about that because I'm white. I just didn't even know that that exists, and that's a real thing. And that makes me so sad that, of course, my kids don't even have to think about that because they're white. So many things. So I get overwhelmed when I watch, like when I watch the 13th Amendment, or when I read Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson's book. It's awesome. I just get really sad and hopeless, but I'm glad that I'm part of this community and this group, because I think in talking about it with others, I think that helps, and that we just can keep learning together. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Can I recommend a book for
Please.
SETTLIN' by Muriel Sims, who is still alive. She is from the old African-American families that settled in Madison. And it's a collection of interviews and things by Madison families and people who moved here from various places. But it gives a really good local
background and the neighborhoods they could and couldn't live in, the kinds of jobs they could and couldn't have, how Oscar Mayer would advertise for a welder, and when a qualified Black man showed up, that job didn't exist, but then they'd hire a white person, and they told him to go work in the most horrible cleanup parts of the slaughtering plant or something. So it's a good collection of local history.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm sorry, can you, one more time, what was the title?
Settlin, S-E-T-T-L-I-N apostrophe. And it talks about the neighborhoods, and the idea was, and I believe Muriel Sims was in the educational system for years and years. And she decided when she retired, she needed to collect these people's memories and from their parents, grandparents, before they died. And so she's put this together, and you know, it's not meant as a history or a great piece of literature. It's a collection of local history, and it's well worth a read. I read it for the Sequoia Library book discussion group before COVID, and it's in lots of copies at the library.
Thank you. We had a couple of comments in the chat that I keep meaning to get back to. Bianca shared a great quote from Marian Anderson that says, "As long as you keep a person down, some part of you has to be down there to hold him down. So it means you cannot soar as you otherwise might." And I agree with Vika, that is a powerful quote. And then Bianca also reminded us of the Confederate flag that was flown at the Capitol riot. Lots of them were actually, yeah. And then to the point about the book by Muriel Sims and redlining, which I'm embarrassed to admit, I didn't even know what that was a few years ago, but Vika commented that we built belt lines and interstates that cut off Black communities. And yeah, we did. And then she also said, so the kids I teach cannot access most of Madison very easily. Few buses, can't ride a bike from their neighborhood into the city.
Mm-hmm. There are so many, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, please, if you want to say more, please do.
There are just so many ways. I work primarily with, most of my students are Black and brown, and there are so many ways in Madison we've harmed kids with the way we've set up schools. When you look at our schools, the biggest schools are the ones that are primarily Black and brown. The smaller neighborhood schools are more white. Every school gets the same number of lunch people. So our lunch person has to serve twice as many people. Our kids are pushed through quicker. There's more of a push to make them behave better because we have to be efficient to get them through. It's just a little piece of their day, but it adds, it builds. We have the same number of custodians at my school as at a school that's half our size. Our custodian has to work harder. They have to do twice as much work. They get grumpier. They're less likely to have time to work with the kids, to have those simple little conversations. I'm an advanced learning teacher in the district. I work with twice as many kids as a smaller school. Our kids, our Black and brown kids, are historically underserved in advanced learning because they don't pass the test, right? And so that's the excuse given is we have fewer advanced learning students, even though we're twice as big. But we've got amazing students at my school, but I can't get to them because there are too many. These are all part of that pipeline. They talk about the school to prison pipeline. I don't know if you've all heard that phrase. It's one I dismissed for a long time, even as a teacher, but I just watched the way we police Black bodies, even as children. And an example that hit me, that made me wake up, was precocious versus a behavior problem. The precocious kid is often the white kid who's off doing their own thing, maybe going around in the corner, doing whatever they want. Well, they're precocious because they're a different way. But a Black child doing the same thing is seen as a behavior problem. And I think the most insidious part is it's seen that way, not just by white leaders, but by Black leaders, because they want to make sure that child learns to play by the rules of white society in order to succeed. But it creates this dynamic that leads to this prison complex. So anyway, I'm sorry, I kind of ramble and rant, but.
No, thank you. But I agree. And that actually leads me, I had so many questions that we're not going to get to, but it leads me to one one area of discussion of Black stigma, you know, and really what we've had this for decades, and now it's applied even to our youngest kids. So how do you think media has contributed to the, quote, dangerous Black man narrative? Or has it? I mean, open for discussion.
Well, it started with Birth of a Nation, right? I mean, that was like it's incredible, I guess, as the movie showed. This is, I think one thread that I think one can follow is that the people who are, and I think, Lori, you're right about the capitalism. I think it's excessive greed that then creates policies that are racist, and so this fear is being created because of greed of some people and normalizing of capitalism. But these policies are created make us fearful, and there arises racism, right? It's a created entity. It's so damaging. But like, starting with that movie, I was amazed how Black people were being so blatantly portrayed as dangerous, when actually it's like, I heard the other day a Black man saying about not understanding. I think he's a personality on CNN, I can't remember his name, but he was saying, it's us who are being killed. Why are people afraid of us? You know, why are white people afraid of us? They are killing us, you know. But it is a pervasive. It just feeds itself, and it goes on because it's benefiting some people. Some people, you know, monetarily, or all of us actually. We all have benefited from the labor. The country was built on Black and brown labor, and I think we owe them. So I think, going back, yeah, I mean, the media just perpetrates it further, but we do need to look at policies. We need to change the policies that affect these awful situations of African American families being separated constantly by mass incarceration. And then you wonder, as Jen was saying, you know, why do kids behave, you know, in certain ways? Well, they don't have stable homes because the parent is, you know, it's like you can understand how these things develop. The parent is in jail, you know, and why is the parent in jail? Well, you know, and then I see, thank you, Ben, for this fact sheet. You know, it's very informative and clear. And I think there is one statement there in which, you know, you're saying that nearly 40% of African American offenders were convicted of drug offenses, even though their rate of illegal drug use is comparable to that of whites. So it's I have heard that also in the schools where my kids have gone. You know, they have told me that they see the Black kids getting into trouble for low-level drug offenses, where the white kids, you know, they could be smelling like they just had a joint and nobody will say anything. So it is really like present in Madison. Yeah, we need to combat that and speak out and change policies. Thank you. That was my 2 cents.
Thank you, Bianca.
I'd like to add, in my preparation for preaching this week, I found the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford, and they summarize his autobiography. And I really appreciated how he wrestled with capitalism. He wrestled with the role of religion and the social gospel. And if you have a chance to take a look at some of that, it takes you into his evolution as a leader and as a thinker. And I thought it was really incredible. I didn't know that he, you know, for example, how he came to know the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and how that really liberated him back to Christianity. And then I in our conversation, I want to give a shout out to the educators in Madison at MMSD, because my daughters, I've noticed in our home life, have pretty fine-tuned media literacy as teens. And that's been a part of their English curriculum and their curriculum. and they've taught me a lot. I've gotten a lot from their MMSD education. And I do want to lift up that aspect of our community's life.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. As I've got two kids, one now in middle school and an elementary school student. And I heard, not in Madison, but I heard just a lot of people lamenting on the 7th of what do we talk to how do we talk to our kids about what just happened? And teachers are afraid to address it, and not necessarily putting blame there, but how can we talk about this? And I gotta say, since they're home, I hear, and it was the first conversation of the day for both of my kids. And I was really grateful to the schools and to their teachers for just addressing it and not pretending that it wasn't happening. So yes, shout out to teachers.
So I have a question for Ben. The Governor Evers has done a number of pardons, and my sense is those are heavily for low-level crimes. Is that right, Ben?
I think generally, I haven't tracked that, but one of the things that sort of is a segue into one of the things that I think would be a helpful thought for all of us to know about, and that is, and again, it goes beyond race. Anybody that's been in trouble is going to have a harder time staying out of trouble in the future. Anybody who's had a slight misadventure, will find themselves buried and sort of get tough on crime, because Wisconsin, we don't have the death penalty. We have very few people that are serving life without parole. So virtually all those members of our community that commit a criminal act will be back with us. And it's in our interest, in my view, to try to treat them in a way where we certainly keep public safety at the forefront, but also do what we can to help them reintegrate back into the community. But that said, typically the pardon power has been exercised, by the sovereign historically to deal with situations where somebody, maybe stole a car when they were 18 and they served in the military and they're like 80 years old now, and they want to sort of meet their maker without a criminal record. And normally they've been really, zero political risk and whatnot. And in fact, in Wisconsin's history, the only governor that ever chose not to exercise that authority was Walker. And so typically, including Evers, there's a panel where people will write to the governor, explain their situation, and the panel will make recommendations as to whether it should be granted or not. And it really has nothing to do with an appeal. It's not that somebody wasn't fairly convicted at the time, but it's more a matter of that they've demonstrated through their conduct after they've paid their price, so to speak, that they're entitled to sort of a second chance. And it sort of embraces a lot of the New Testament lessons of forgiveness and whatnot. And so, I'm pleased to see how he's using that. The one other thing I guess I would mention to you, and a couple of things. One is what's called in the field the collateral consequences of conviction. If somebody is harmed by a crime, and we often think, all mature societies sort of have to have some mechanism to hold people accountable for the choices they make. But then the question is, when does that end, if ever? And right now in Wisconsin, for example, there's limitations if you have a criminal record about employment opportunities. In fact, one thing our local Moses group that we're involved in, we are involved in having, at least locally, what's called ban the box. And that is when you apply for a job, you can't be asked in a written application whether you have a criminal record, because often that gets kicked out before you get an interview. And so some of the employment limitations from being convicted are something you can never live down. And that's one area where I think we can improve opportunities for people that are coming out of prison or jail. Secondly, we have severe restrictions on student loan availability to people with a criminal record. And so many people don't have an opportunity to go to school, whether it be a vocational school or other higher education, simply because they were convicted of a crime that renders them completely ineligible for student financial aid. We all know there's also the limitations on the driving privilege. And it was mentioned earlier, when you look at where jobs are and where people live, in Milwaukee is a really good example. Some of the factory jobs that are in Butler, Germantown, some of the outlying areas, people in the inner city can't get there. And over half of the African-American males in Milwaukee don't have driver's licenses and whatnot. And then also one thing that we have fairly severe restrictions in Wisconsin, and my prediction is that more are on the way, and that's limitations on voting and whatnot. And so I think some of the things, at the core of many of this, so many of these policies that have had a disparate impact on mainly poor people, but certainly people of color, are either local or state policies. And one way we can have, I think, more influence than we've had is to, one, become more informed about this. And I'm so pleased to see us doing that here. And secondly, be more active in terms of voting and who we elect and being sort of vocal. One of the things that I see as somewhat positive, in some states have changed and shortened sentences and whatnot. They're not doing it because of a sense of fairness or guilt. They're doing it because it costs money and it's not a cost-effective way to spend limited public resources. And so being aware of how much it costs to have somebody in prison, how much it costs. And, one of the things, and this is something that even Governor Doyle and Thompson and Walker all agreed in, something you may have heard of truth in sentencing. Well, about 15 years ago, we eliminated parole, which basically meant that somebody couldn't earn their way out by behaving well in prison. And we said, if you get a 10-year sentence, you have to serve 10 years. At the same time, the legislature literally doubled the penalties for almost every crime. So without any particular compelling indication that that was necessary, what was usually worth 5 years in prison now is worth 10 years. And that's, maybe a $500,000 or more, because it's about $40,000, $50,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. And then secondly, Wisconsin is way out of line compared to other states about the length of supervision. A lot of statistics show that if somebody is released from prison, the first 24 months are when they're more likely to get in trouble. We have people that have like 25, 30 years of parole supervision, and they're subject to a lot of really arcane technical rules that really have very little to do whether they're a risk to the public. And right now, about 50% of the new admissions in prison are not for new crimes. They're people that were not able to, there were sort of enough of free spirits, if you will, that they couldn't comply with all the rules of supervision and whatnot. And so I think, there's a number of things that we can do in Wisconsin, shorten prison sentences, be more welcoming to people in our community, not shut them off from some of the opportunities for job training or education. And there's a lot of little things that may not seem to be, hitting the home run, if you will, as we've all talked about with dealing with disparate treatment of people in our community. But, a lot of singles can score runs just like a few home runs can. So in any event, enough, you guys deserve better than listening to me blather on a Sunday morning. But
Thank you, Ben. It's actually really
Ben?
great to hear your perspective. Nancy, please.
Ben?
yes.
Ben, I have a question. It's a small one compared to what you just shared. But what role do you think the CCAP plays in general with people who've met the law in one way or another, been met up by the law?
Well, first I'd say I liked CCAP when my daughter started dating. And I never let her forget it. I'm of two minds on CCAP. As you probably know, that lists a number of things, and it's not always real easy to read, but it lists somebody that's been charged or convicted of a crime. And so people can sort of like end run, ban the box or other protections and not rent to people or hire them because they can see that they may have been subject to either criminal charges or may have been evicted 5 times before. And while I'm mindful of that as a problem, on the other hand, I think CCAP also serves a really important goal, and that is it allows for transparency for some of our government actors that have more power over us than others do: police, prosecutors, judges. And so I think the benefits we all gain from public access and transparency somewhat outweigh the others. And what I've suggested in some other forums, if we want to try to avoid improperly using CCAP to deny education or employment or housing opportunities, let's use the carrot rather than the stick. Let's give some tax breaks to landlords willing to take a chance on somebody who's been evicted or has a criminal record. Let's give the employer that's willing to give somebody a job some type of a tax or other break and whatnot, and see if that is a way to respond to it. So in any event, my response to CCAP.
Well, I ask because many times people, regardless of color, who have a mental illness are frequently negatively impacted by CCAP. So perhaps, we can talk about that another time, you and I. Thank you.
So it's 11:32. We're technically out of time. I know some of you have to leave. But are there those that would want to stay on for just a minute or two more? Or does anybody else have anything really burning that they wanted to get to that we haven't talked about? I know there's so much.
This is Carolyn. I would like to suggest a couple of things real quickly. One is that the new book by Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, is Cast. And that's a really good understanding of, in some ways, how we've gotten to where we are. The other comment I would make that I felt about the film that was particularly strong was they spent quite a bit of time talking about ALEC. And it is an example of the way in which our legislators have been influenced by private groups. And I think we need to look and be careful and understand what kinds of mechanisms are behind some of these things that we don't really know about. ALEC was not known for a long time, and yet they were writing rules and writing laws backwards and forwards. So I think that really, I was glad to see that lifted up in the film. So thanks.
I'll just add to Carolyn. I just called a friend of mine about this website, and I'm glad to hear you, Carolyn, recommended that book, because I did put it in the chat. It's the subtitle is The Origins of Our Discontent, and she highly recommend. Oh, there you go. Isabel Wilkerson. Great. Makes me want to read it just knowing. Thanks, Greg. Also, there's a teacher, I asked this of Vika because you're a teacher, but I would recommend looking at this website, Root to Rise, root and then the number 2 rise.org. It was started by a friend of mine who unfairly was accused of discrimination when the opposite was true. She was trying to help the Black kids that she was teaching. And anyway, that's my 2 cents. Thanks. I'm glad I got that in. Thank you, Lori and Mark and everybody else who's on the responsible, Bianca, I'm sure, too, for putting this all together. I hope we do it again.
We will. We will. We don't have the next date set yet, but we're going to just keep talking and keep learning. I think we should probably wrap it up, but I wanted to get, Mark Banghart had sent me a really great question, and I know you kind of alluded to this earlier, Mark, but we can talk about it for a little bit, but also just to leave us with thinking about this, that what do we as members of Midvale feel and think about our culpability and responsibility as a church and as individuals? Because we all have to be a part of this change that we want. So I thought that was a really, really good question. Does anybody want to share any thoughts on that before we end? Okay. If not, I think we're already 5 minutes over, so we will end, but I want to thank everybody so much. Thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for being open and willing to discuss. And I just appreciate your time being here today.
And Laurie, let me know when you guys are ready to do another discussion. And I think Mark's question is a great question to ponder as we move in toward Lent. I know we're still in Epiphany, but it does kind of set the stage for us to move forward. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
close it out for everyone. So.
Vika, are you still on? Or Vika, I'm sorry, Vika?
I don't believe so.
Oh, she was looking for information about joining the racial justice group. And I tried to chat her and it won't go through. So I was trying to catch her before she goes.
Okay.
I'm sure somebody at the church can get me a contact for her if she's connected with the church.
Yeah, I would check with Pam Fry.
Yeah, that's what I was going to start with.
Good call.
Yep, thank you.